Let us understand what is letter of credit. Let's look at this transaction. There is a seller and a buyer. Seller selling goods to buyer and buyer is making payment to seller immediately, and there is no complication in this transaction. We can say it's a normal transaction. But just think of a transaction where the buyer and seller are in different geographies or say in different countries, and they do not know much about each other, but this buyer wants to purchase goods on credit and seller is also ready to sell on credit, but seller does not know this buyer thoroughly, and because of that he lacks faith. And here the seller says to the buyer, if you can give me some kind of a comfort or security, I am ready to sell goods on credit. So what this buyer will do, he will approach his bank where he is having his working capital facilities, and he'll explain the situation that there is a seller who is ready to sell goods on credit, but he needs some kind of a comfort. So what this bank will do, after assessing the position of the buyer, that is bank's customer, this bank will send a letter called letter of credit, and in that letter bank will say, hey seller, you can sell goods on credit to this buyer who is our customer. And hereby saying this, bank is indirectly assuring the financial standing of the buyer, and then bank also gives assurance that buyer will make payment on the due date. And in case if the buyer is not making the payment on the due date, then do not worry, you come and ask us, we will pay you provided you guys have agreed on all the conditions. That is, you guys agree on conditions and comply with the conditions. That say for buying goods, buyer will place certain conditions, and only when seller comply with all the conditions, as a banker we will honor it. Okay, so that will be mentioned in the letter of credit by the buyer's bank to the seller's bank. Now seller has got a big comfort because there is an assurance, that too from the bank, that buyer will make payment on the due date, and even if buyer does not pay any money, okay, he is going to get that money from the bank provided that seller is complying with all the conditions that are mentioned in the letter of credit. Okay, so on the strength of this letter of credit, seller is going to sell goods to the buyer on credit basis, and it is the duty of the buyer to make payment on the due date to the seller. But what will happen if buyer does not pay on the due date? Simple, seller will ask the bank to make payment which has issued letter of credit, and this scenario will be called as devolvement of LC. If all conditions stipulated in the letter of credit are complied by the seller, then the bank which had issued LC has no room to escape. They have to make payment to the seller. Of course, eventually they can collect it from the buyer, but they got to meet the payment to the seller. So this mechanism is nothing but LC mechanism, and it promotes trade. It helps various transactions to take place. Okay, so this is about LC. And who are the parties generally involved in LC? Number one, the buyer, we call him as applicant. Two, seller, we call him as beneficiary. And number three is the bank of the buyer, that is LC issuing bank. Okay, we call it as LC issuing bank. And the LC will not be dispatched simply through post. It will be routed through another bank in seller place. We call that bank as advising bank. And sometimes seller may be in a dominating position, or seller may not believe the LC issued by the issuing bank of the buyer. Seller may stipulate a condition saying that LC got to be confirmed by bank in his location. So another bank may also come into picture. We call that bank as a confirming bank, and it's through these banks the entire LC process revolves.